Having already discussed the far-left socialist radicalism of Kamala Harris's running mate, one Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, the Democratic vice presidential nominee, it would be appropriate to compare and contrast him with the current vice president and Democratic nominee for president, Harris. Amazingly, there's nothing to contrast because they're the same progressive socialists cut from the same cloth. All you have to do to see how radicalized the National Democratic Party has become is to only look back to 2020. Back then, the Democrats were in a panic because after the Iowa and New Hampshire primaries, if you remember, the leading contenders for the Democratic nomination for president were Senator Bernie Sanders, socialist, Senator Elizabeth Warren, socialist, and Pete Buttigieg, the mayor of South Bend, Indiana, closet socialist. The horror. The Democratic brain trusts were in a shambles. This country would never elect a socialist as president. The last time such a far-left nominee was put up by the Democrats, 1972's George McGovern, who was a mere liberal, not a socialist, they lost 49 out of 50 states to Richard Nixon. Therefore, something drastic had to be done, and it was. The powers that be got behind Joe Biden, who had just finished 5th in the New Hampshire primary, in single digits, and was getting ready to drop out of the race. And then the Democrats pulled off a magic trick. With the help of former President Barack Obama and Congressman Clyburn of South Carolina, they helped Biden win South Carolina big, and the momentum carried him on to the Democratic nomination. This miracle was akin to Jesus raising Lazarus from the grave. Then they did the right thing. They kept Joe Biden mostly locked in his basement for the entire fall campaign in 2020 because they remembered even when Biden was younger and at the top of his game, for example, in his presidential runs in 1988 and 2008, his foot and mouth disease ended those campaigns. And then, of course, there was the plagiarism issue. The reason they chose Biden was he was the only credible moderate candidate in the race. And remember, that's where 80% of voters, Republican and Democrat, are. Biden was their only option, and the magic trick worked. He won. Now, 4 years later, the National Democratic Party picked two far-left socialists to represent their party. Remember, they had a chance to balance their ticket, to pick a moderate, major blue state, wall state, in fact, one of their blue wall states, Governor Josh Shapiro of Pennsylvania. They didn't. They doubled down with Walz. Having already discussed Tim Walz in an earlier view, I'll now turn my attention to Kamala Harris, specifically on policy issues. And she has spent, by the way, most of her time since being nominated hiding from the press and only doing one interview with CNN, with her support dog in tow, Tim Walz, and it was a disaster, unless you're into incomprehensible word salads. Just how far left is Kamala Harris? Let me tell you. After she cast a tie-breaking vote in favor of the multi-trillion-dollar cash infusion into an already overheated economy back in 2021, over the objection of renowned liberal Harvard economist Larry Summers, who had been Democratic President Barack Obama's Secretary of the Treasury, Harris's plan to deal with the aftershocks of record inflation she helped bring about for the economy is higher taxes to fund more discretionary spending for entitlement programs and unbelievably taxing unrealized capital gains. And to combat the high inflation this will cause, she's going to establish price controls to keep grocery prices in check, which almost all economists agree will do the exact opposite and cause greater inflation and food shortages. Now we will turn our attention to the southern border. Kamala Harris has said countless times she supports an open border. And as borders are, she clearly did. She has welcomed and presided over the greatest invasion of illegal immigrants our country has ever seen. Next on the progressive wish list, she supports radical gender ideology and supports trans biological males competing against young girls and women in sports. including full access to girls' locker rooms. You should read how the Biden-Harris administration has rewritten Title IX. Thankfully, the federal courts have already struck down some of their ridiculously far-left rhetoric because it's unconstitutional. It's a denial of equal protection for young girls and young women. Also, remember that her running mate, Tim Walz, has biological females who identify as boys covered in his administration in Minnesota by placing tampons in the boys' bathrooms in Minnesota public schools. This is social engineering at its craziest. Now we'll turn our attention to Kamala Harris's record on crime. She fully supports George Soros-endorsed approach to law enforcement, including not prosecuting most retail theft, supporting the devastation caused after the death of George Floyd in the riots that broke out across this country. And when Kamala Harris was the district attorney or prosecutor of San Francisco, she shielded illegal immigrants from deportation even after they committed violent crimes. In one case, a drug-dealing illegal immigrant who had been arrested, she put into a jobs program, a job he couldn't legally hold. So what did she do? She cleared his criminal record. This miscreant would go on then to assault and almost kill a woman. In another case when she was DA, Kamala Harris released an illegal immigrant who had been arrested for unlicensed driving. He would go on to continue his illegal driving, except this time he struck Drew Rosenberg with his car and ran him over 3 times, killing him. That should cover her stance on law enforcement and crime. Now let's turn our attention to the fact that she adamantly, on the record, has voiced her opposition to all fossil fuel and fracking, although she now claims to be in favor of those things. These policies led directly to a 50% increase in gas prices, and many middle-class working families have to make hard choices of heat or eat in the winter in America. This November, we are going to get a clear answer on what type of country we are going to be. To me, I remember 2019 very well, and the type of America I was living in then. That seems like a long time ago.